On July 4, 1946, more than 200,000 people gathered in absolute silence on a hill in Gdansk, Poland. The reason to witness the chilling mass execution of 11 young women, former Nazi guards of the Stutthof concentration camp. In front of the crowd, these women, some barely 20 years old, waited with a rope around their neck, condemned for torturing, murdering, and sending thousands of innocent victims toward death. What led these young women to transform into ruthless monsters? This is the shocking story behind the brutal final fate of the most perverse guards of Nazism. Stutthof, the last Nazi hell and the silenced massacre of the Holocaust. The Stutthof concentration camp, located near the city of Gdansk, formerly Gdansk, Poland, represents one of the darkest and least known episodes of the Holocaust. Established on September 2, 1939, one day after the German invasion of Poland, Stutthof was the first Nazi concentration camp outside the German borders and the last to be liberated by the Allied forces on May 9, 1945. During its operation, approximately 110,000 people were deported to Stutthof, of which more than 85,000 lost their lives due to inhuman conditions, diseases, executions, and forced labor. Before the invasion of Poland, the Nazi authorities in the Free City of Gdansk had already identified the Polish and Jewish intelligence as main targets. The Free City of Gdansk, an autonomous territory under the supervision of the League of Nations since 1920, had been a focus of tensions between Germany and Poland due to the significant German population that resided there and the interest of the Third Reich in annexing the region. With the arrival of the Nazis to power in 1933, the policies of Germanization and segregation began to be implemented with greater rigor and the anti-Semitic sentiment intensified, preparing the ground for future deportations and mass executions. From 1936, the German intelligence services, in collaboration with local Nazi sympathizers, began to compile information about members of the Polish intelligence, Jewish intellectuals, political leaders, and social activists. The lists of subversive elements included professors, writers, doctors, priests, businessmen, and prominent figures from the Jewish and Polish community. For the Nazis, these groups represented a potential threat to their control over Gdansk and their plans for annexation of the territory. The strategy was clear: eliminate the leaders and influential personalities of Polish society to facilitate absolute dominance of the region and weaken any possible organized resistance. In parallel to the compilation of information, the Nazi authorities began to search for strategic locations to establish internment centers. The original idea was to have an isolated place where they could imprison, interrogate, and eventually execute the enemies of the Reich, without raising suspicions among the civilian population nor attracting the attention of the international community. Stutthof, a swampy and wooded area northeast of Gdansk, was chosen for its geographical isolation and its proximity to key transportation routes that would facilitate the transfer of prisoners. Initially, Stutthof functioned as a civil internment camp under the administration of the Gdansk police. In its first months of operation, the camp housed mainly Polish intellectuals, Jews, and political dissidents arrested after the invasion of Poland in September 1939. The conditions in this initial phase were already extremely harsh. The prisoners were forced to build their own barracks and to work on the expansion of the camp without adequate tools nor appropriate clothing for the climatic conditions. The physical punishments, the lack of food, and the arbitrary executions began from the first moment. As the war advanced and the Nazi control over the occupied territories consolidated, the function of the camp changed. In November 1941, Stutthof was transformed into a labor education camp administered by the German Security Service. Under this new scheme, the prisoners were subjected to forced labor in brutal conditions, with exhausting workdays in armament factories, quarries, and infrastructure projects. The idea of labor education had no rehabilitative purpose. It was in reality a policy of covert extermination through physical exhaustion and starvation. The prisoners who could not meet the work quotas were executed immediately or abandoned to their fate until dying of weakness or disease. Finally, in January 1942, Stutthof was elevated to the category of regular concentration camp under the supervision of the SS, formally integrating into the vast network of camps controlled by the Reich. This change meant an expansion of the camp, the arrival of more prisoners of different nationalities, and the implementation of more systematic extermination methods. From this moment, Stutthof ceased to be just a detention and forced labor center to become one more link within the Nazi machinery of death. Over time, the camp would receive thousands of prisoners from Poland, the Baltic countries, the Soviet Union, and later from other concentration camps like Auschwitz. The original camp, known as the Old Camp, was surrounded by a barbed wire fence and comprised 8 barracks for the inmates and a commandanter for the SS guards, covering a total area of 0.012 square kilometers. These rudimentary facilities were designed initially to house a limited number of prisoners. However, as the war advanced and the Nazi extermination machinery expanded, the camp began to receive thousands of additional prisoners, which led to a drastic need for expansion. In 1943, a massive expansion project was initiated that transformed Stutthof into a large-scale concentration camp. The new section of the camp built next to the old camp was surrounded by an electrified wire fence that reinforced the security measures and prevented any escape attempt. This additional sector contained 30 new barracks, structures designed to house a much larger number of prisoners in conditions of extreme overcrowding. The expansion elevated the total surface of the camp to 1.2 square kilometers and allowed to significantly increase its operational capacity. In addition to the barracks for prisoners, in the 1943 expansion, other fundamental facilities for the Nazi extermination machinery were added. Forced labor workshops were built where the prisoners were forced to manufacture components for the German war industry, mainly in the production of airplane parts and ammunition. Warehouses were also installed to confiscate and classify the belongings of the murdered prisoners, as well as administrative offices for the camp's bureaucracy, which included detailed records of each prisoner and lists of deportations to other extermination camps. The growth of the camp coincided with its formal incorporation into the system of the final solution, the Nazi genocidal policy for the systematic extermination of the Jews of Europe. In the expansion of the camp in 1943, Stutthof would go from being an internment and forced labor camp to becoming an active extermination center. To implement this new function, a crematorium was built with capacity to eliminate hundreds of corpses per day, reducing the time and resources used in the disposal of the bodies. A gas chamber designed specifically to carry out mass executions of prisoners was also established. The Stutthof gas chamber, operational from June 1944, was designed to murder up to 150 people per session with Zyklon B, the cyanide-based pesticide used in other camps like Auschwitz and Majdanek. The execution was carried out in a brick building with a single entrance and a small sealed window through which the executioners poured the Zyklon B crystals. Death by asphyxiation occurred in a few minutes, depending on the physical resistance of the victims. However, as the flow of deportations increased in the second half of 1944, the capacity of the camp was insufficient to carry out the extermination at the speed demanded by the SS. For the most part, the new prisoners were Jews deported from the Baltic countries and Poland, along with political prisoners and members of the resistance captured in occupied territories. Faced with the overload, the Nazis began to use mobile gas wagons, hermetically sealed trucks, into whose interior carbon monoxide was introduced. The prisoners were overcrowded in these vehicles under the deception of a transfer and, after a journey of barely a few minutes, they died asphyxiated. Once they arrived at the common graves previously excavated in the surroundings of the camp, the bodies were unloaded and buried en masse. This practice, although less efficient than the fixed gas chamber, became a complementary method to accelerate the extermination, but the systematic murder was not limited to the gassings. The Stutthof camp had a shooting area where the prisoners were executed in groups. The victims, weakened by hunger and diseases, were lined up in front of ditches, previously excavated, and shot at point-blank range. Witnesses described how on occasions the Nazis forced the prisoners to throw themselves alive into the pits before being machine-gunned, ensuring that the bodies fell directly into the collective grave. Others were murdered by the method of shooting in the nape of the neck in a barrack enabled as an execution room. In this place, they were made to kneel before a drainage gutter that facilitated the cleaning of the blood, and an SS officer shot them with a pistol at the base of the skull. In addition to the shootings, the camp became a scene of brutal executions by beatings. The prisoners, especially those considered too weak to work, were murdered with sticks, metal bars, or rifle butts. In some cases, the guards organized spectacles in which they forced the strongest prisoners to kill others with punches or with rudimentary tools. These practices not only served as a method of extermination, but also as an exercise in extreme dehumanization in which the victims were forced to participate in the destruction of their own community. The forced labor in Stutthof also became a form of covert execution. The prisoners were sent to perform exhausting jobs, from the construction of roads and fortifications to the production of armament for the Wehrmacht. Without access to warm clothing in winter nor to a minimum of food, many prisoners succumbed to exhaustion. Those who could not stay on their feet were beaten to death or sent directly to the gas chamber. In the last phase of the camp, when resources began to scarce and the evacuation became imminent, the Nazis stopped bothering to eliminate the prisoners in an organized way. They simply abandoned them without food or water, condemning them to a slow death. The Ladies of Terror, guardians of Stutthof and their reign of cruelty. The Nazi regime not only used men in its structure of repression and extermination, but also recruited women who played a key role in the surveillance of the concentration camps. In Stutthof, several of these guardians achieved notoriety for their cruelty and sadism, becoming figures feared by the prisoners. Many of them did not have military training nor experience in this type of functions before the war. However, under the indoctrination of the regime and the power that was granted to them, they transformed into ruthless executors of Nazi terror. From 1944, with the growing shortage of male personnel due to the mobilization of soldiers toward the Eastern Front, the SS faced a serious lack of personnel in the concentration camps. To cover this need, they intensified the recruitment of women in Gdansk and other nearby cities, expanding the surveillance structure with female personnel. This recruitment was not limited to volunteers, but in some cases mandatory calls were issued directed at young unemployed women or with backgrounds in state industries. Recruitment offices were established in several cities, and propaganda networks were used to promote the role of the woman in the Nazi war effort, not only in armament factories or agricultural labors, but also within the repression system of the Reich. The propaganda posters, advertisements in local newspapers, and speeches in party meetings exalted the need for strong and committed women who wanted to support the homeland in a decisive moment. In many cases, the women saw the offer as an opportunity to escape poverty, obtain more abundant food rations, and access job security that in times of war was uncertain in other sectors. In particular, those who came from rural environments or with limited education felt attracted by the possibility of receiving a stable salary and lodging within the camps, which guaranteed them a more structured life than the one they had in their homes. Many of them had never had positions of power and suddenly found themselves with absolute authority over defenseless prisoners, which for some supposed a total transformation in their attitude and behavior. While some women entered the system out of economic necessity, others did it out of ideological conviction. From young they had been indoctrinated in the League of German Girls, BDM, the Nazi Party youth organization for women, where values of discipline, obedience, and absolute loyalty to Hitler were inculcated in them. Upon arriving at the camps, these women, previously educated in the idea of racial superiority and the need to eliminate the enemies of the Reich, found in their new role a validation of those teachings. The brutality was not only permitted, but expected. Those who showed greater hardness were promoted to positions of greater responsibility. To many it was taught that they should see the prisoners not as people, but as subversive elements, whose existence put in danger the future of Germany. The training of these guardians was brief, but intense. They were subjected to an accelerated instruction in discipline, handling of prisoners, and punishments. In addition to a strict physical training to ensure that they were capable of exercising their authority without hesitations, absolute obedience to their male superiors within the SS hierarchy, and a disposition to impose order without questions was expected of them. They were taught to handle weapons, to recognize signs of insubordination, and to apply physical punishments without hesitating. Many internalized this doctrine with an alarming fanaticism, assuming with enthusiasm their role in the repressive machinery of Nazism. Over time, some guardians even developed a sadistic enjoyment in the exercise of their power, becoming more ruthless than what their superiors would have demanded. The guardians of the Stutthof concentration camp played a crucial role in the Nazi machinery of terror. Among them, 4 figures stand out for the cruelty of their actions: Jenny Wanda Barkmann, Gerda Steinhoff, Elisabeth Becker, and Wanda Klaff. Jenny Wanda Barkmann was born on May 30, 1922, in Hamburg. In 1944, she joined as an auxiliary guardian to the female subcamp SK3 of Stutthof, where she quickly earned the nickname of the Beautiful Spectre due to her youthful appearance that contrasted with her extreme cruelty. The testimonies of survivors describe her whipping prisoners until leaving them unconscious and showing an indifferent attitude during the executions in the gas chambers. As the Red Army approached, Barkmann tried to flee, but was captured in May 1945 at the train station of Gdansk. During her trial, she showed a carefree attitude, laughing and flirting with her guards, which accentuated the perception of her lack of remorse. Gerda Steinhoff, born on January 29, 1922, in Danig-Langfur, worked initially as a cook. In 1944, she responded to the Nazi call to recruit guardians and joined the staff of Stutthof. On October 1, 1944, she was appointed block supervisor in the female subcamp SK3, actively participating in the selections of prisoners for the gas chambers. On October 31, 1944, she ascended to the rank of SS Oberaufseherin and was assigned to the Danzig home subcamp. Subsequently, on December 1, 1944, she was transferred to the female subcamp of Bromberg-Ost in Bydgoszcz. For her loyalty and services to the Third Reich, she received the Iron Cross on January 25, 1945. After the war, she was arrested on May 25, 1945, and during her trial she was recognized for her severity and participation in selections for executions. Elisabeth Becker was born on July 20, 1923, in Niek, in the territory of the Free City of Danzig. At 13 years old, she joined the League of German Girls, and in 1938 she worked as a tram driver in Danig. In 1944, she was recruited by the SS and arrived at Stutthof on September 5, 1944, where she also participated in selections of women and children for the gas chambers and physically mistreated prisoners. On January 15, 1945, she fled the camp and returned to her home in Niek, where she was arrested on April 13 of that same year. Wanda Klaff, born as Wanda Kalachinska on March 6, 1922, in Danzig, worked in a jam factory before marrying in 1942 and becoming a housewife. In 1944, she joined the staff of Stutthof in Prost, where she committed abuses against numerous prisoners. On October 5, 1944, she was transferred to the subcamp of Russo-Shin, continuing with her sadistic acts. She fled the camp at the beginning of 1945, but was arrested on June 11 while suffering from typhoid fever. During her trial, she admitted enjoying her work in the camp. All of them were condemned to death and publicly executed by hanging on July 4, 1946, on the hill of Biskupia Gorka, near Gdansk. The testimonies of the survivors describe punishments applied with a particular fury, executed many times without any justification, simply because the guardian on duty felt like it. The methods of torture varied from prolonged beating sessions to psychological punishments designed to break the will of the inmates. One of the most feared practices was the punishment of the ice cage. Prisoners, mostly women, were forced to undress and remain for hours in the camp courtyard under extreme climatic conditions. In the middle of winter, with temperatures that descended below -10 degrees C, they were forced to stay standing without moving while the snow accumulated on their bodies. Any attempt to cover themselves with their arms was responded with blows or with jets of icy water, accelerating the hypothermia. Some prisoners did not resist and collapsed. Others, still conscious, saw how their companions fell one by one around them, turned into immobile figures of bluish flesh. Among the most sadistic guardians who stood out for the coldness with which these punishments were applied is Jenny Wanda Barkman. But the sadism of the guardians was not limited to physical torture. The psychological humiliation was a weapon as effective as the whip or the gas chamber. Often, the prisoners were forced to perform absurd or degrading tasks for the pure entertainment of their executioners. Some survivors told how the guardians organized games with the inmates, ordering them to fight among themselves, hit each other, or perform ridiculous dances under threat of death. One of the cruelest tactics consisted of forcing weakened prisoners to carry corpses of their own companions for long hours, without allowing them to rest or cry for the dead. If they fell from exhaustion, they were immediately executed on the spot. Elizabeth Becker, another of the infamous guardians of Stutthof, had a particular way of showing her contempt for the life of the prisoners. It is said that she enjoyed beating to death sick or too weak prisoners to work. She made them form a line in front of an execution pit, and with a wooden stick in her hand she went selecting them one by one. The chosen ones were taken to a barrack where they were executed with a shot in the nape of the neck, or on occasions they were beaten to death by other prisoners forced to do it. In some cases, the guardians did not need any excuse to kill. Wanda Claff, known for her arrogant attitude even during her trial, was feared for her use of the whip. A simple look was enough for her to determine who would live and who would die that day. Her specialty was beating the prisoners to the point of unconsciousness and then throwing them into piles of corpses, still alive, so that they died slowly from asphyxiation or internal hemorrhages. Beyond the physical violence, there was a degree of perversion in the way these women exercised their power. Gerda Steinhoff, promoted to the rank of supervisor in Stutthof, boasted of her ability to detect signs of weakness in the prisoners. To those who seemed to be on the verge of collapsing, she subjected them to inhuman resistance tests, like forcing them to carry sacks of cement for hours or dig enormous pits only to be shot and thrown into them immediately afterward. But perhaps one of the most terrifying episodes described in the testimonies was the use of attack dogs to tear prisoners apart. Some guardians, especially those with higher rank, trained dogs to pounce on the inmates at the slightest sign of disobedience. The animals were fed with a special diet to foster aggressiveness and usually attacked directly at the neck or the face of the victims. Multiple cases were reported in which prisoners were torn apart alive in front of their companions, while the guardians observed the scene with apparent satisfaction. The trials of Stutthof, the hunt and condemnation of the shadows of the Reich. After the fall of the Third Reich and the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps, the international community and the directly affected countries faced the immense challenge of imparting justice. In Poland, where the Stutthof camp had been established, the authorities undertook a series of judicial processes to judge those responsible for the atrocities committed in this place. It was not only an act of justice, but an effort to document and expose the magnitude of the crimes perpetrated. The processes initiated in Gdansk in 1946 marked a precedent in accountability, since not only high-ranking officers were prosecuted, but also female guardians, demonstrating that the brutality within the camps was not exclusive to men and that responsibility should fall on all those who had contributed to the extermination machinery regardless of their gender or hierarchy. The arrests of the accused began almost immediately after the liberation of the camp in May 1945. The disorganization of the collapsed Nazi regime and the rapid occupation of the Soviet troops in the region prevented many of the responsible from escaping to safe zones. Some officers tried to flee toward the west with the hope of surrendering to the Western Allies instead of falling into Soviet or Polish hands. but the majority failed in their attempt. Others opted to hide in small nearby villages or in the main cities, changing their names and destroying documents that linked them to the concentration camp. However, the degree of notoriety of certain members of the staff, especially of the most sadistic guardians, made their anonymity difficult. The local population, aware of the terror lived in Stutthof, did not take long to denounce them before the new authorities, which led to the capture of several of them in a matter of weeks or months. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, which were centered on the political and military leaders of Nazi Germany, the processes in Gdansk took a different approach by judging lower-ranking supervisors. This fact was not minor, since it represented a change in the vision of individual responsibility within the Nazi genocidal apparatus. In Stutthof, not only were the SS officers who issued orders processed, but also those who, although they did not occupy high positions, personally executed acts of violence and actively participated in the oppression of the prisoners. Among the captured were female guardians, an unusual circumstance in the post-war tribunals, since although many women worked in the concentration camps, few had been brought to justice until that moment. During the trial, which took place between April 25 and May 31, 1946, heartbreaking testimonies of survivors were presented that detailed scenes of extreme brutality. These statements included accounts of arbitrary murders, systematic tortures, and mass executions carried out both in the gas chambers and in the forests near the camp. The witnesses described how the prisoners were subjected to inhuman conditions, being victims of constant physical and psychological abuses by the camp staff. The tribunal, composed of Polish and Soviet authorities, showed a firm determination to impart exemplary justice. Of the 15 accused, 11 were condemned to death, including figures like the SS Oberfuhrer Johann Pauls and the guardians Jenny Wanda Barkmann, Elisabeth Becker, Wanda Klaff, Eva Paradis, and Gerda Steinhoff. The executions were carried out publicly on July 4, 1946, in Biskupia Gorka, a hill near Gdansk, where a crowd witnessed the implementation of the sentences. During the trials of Stutthof, the attitude of the accused revealed a wide range of behaviors that oscillated between remorse and defiant denial. Some showed signs of remorse or fear for their fate, while others minimized their participation in the crimes or justified their actions under the premise of obedience to superior orders. Among the most highlighted figures was Jenny Wanda Barkmann. During the trial, Barkmann showed a frivolous and carefree attitude, even laughing and flirting with her guards, which contrasted profoundly with the gravity of the accusations against her. This conduct was perceived as a lack of remorse and a denial of responsibility for her actions. On the other hand, Irmgard Furchner, who worked as a secretary in the Stutthof concentration camp, was accused in 2021 of complicity in more than 11,000 murders. During her trial, Furchner denied her responsibility, arguing that her administrative role did not involve her directly in the atrocities committed. However, the tribunal considered that by handling the correspondence and documents related to the camp's operations, she was aware of the crimes that occurred there. This posture of denial and justification reflects how some accused tried to distance themselves from their actions, alluding to the nature of their functions. The testimonies presented during the trials were fundamental to expose the magnitude of the sadism of some accused. Survivors related episodes of extreme cruelty that went beyond the orders received, evidencing that in many cases the perpetrators acted moved by a sense of absolute power and dehumanization of the victims. These statements made clear that beyond blind obedience to the Nazi regime, in Stutthof there were individuals who enjoyed the absolute power that their position granted them. The sentences dictated after the first trial of Stutthof were executed on July 4, 1946, on the hill of Biskupia Gorka, near Gdansk. Unlike other post-war executions, these were carried out publicly, attracting a crowd that wished to witness the punishment of the perpetrators. The decision to carry out public executions reflected the deep longing for justice of the population, which had suffered under the Nazi occupation and sought a form of closure and retribution. However, the public nature of the executions generated debates among observers and authorities. While some considered that these actions were necessary to satisfy the popular clamor and serve as a warning against future crimes, others argued that such spectacles could dehumanize society and turn justice into a form of public vengeance. The Polish authorities, upon observing the reactions and the behavior of the multitudes during these executions, began to question the efficacy and the morality of public executions. As a result, the decision was made to prohibit future public executions in Poland, transferring these acts to more private and controlled environments to preserve the dignity of the judicial process and avoid possible public disorders. Despite the forcefulness of these trials, the question about whether justice was sufficient remains open. Although the main captured perpetrators were judged and condemned, many others, including some higher-ranking officers, managed to escape or simply were not processed. In addition, the speed of the trials left doubts about whether each case was investigated thoroughly or if some condemnations were based more on the need to impart exemplary punishments than on concrete proofs. However, what is undeniable is that the trials of Stutthof in Gdansk marked a crucial point in the history of post-war justice, demonstrating that even the crimes committed by lower-ranking figures would not remain unpunished. On July 4, 1946, the gallows of Biskupia Gorka and the last settling of scores. On July 4, 1946, the hill of Biskupia Gorka in Gdansk was the scene of one of the most significant public executions of the post-war, marking a milestone in the search for justice after the atrocities committed in the Stutthof concentration camp. The preparations for the public executions of July 4, 1946, in Biskupia Gorka were meticulously organized to guarantee both the efficacy of the act and its impact on the community. The construction of the gallows was carried out with precision, erecting robust structures capable of supporting multiple simultaneous executions. These platforms were situated strategically in an elevated and cleared area of the hill, ensuring optimal visibility for the thousands of attendees who would congregate to witness the event. The choice of Biskupia Gorka as the place of the executions was not arbitrary. Historically, this hill had had a strategic importance due to its proximity to the main city and its natural elevation, which turned it into an ideal observation point. During the 10th century, fortifications were built on the hill due to its strategic relevance. In addition, after the partitions of Poland, Polish insurgents of the November Uprising were imprisoned by the Prussians in these fortifications. This location not only facilitated the control of the crowd, but also added a symbolic weight to the act by being carried out in a place loaded with history and meaning for the local community. The logistics of the event implied a close coordination between the local authorities and the security forces. Measures were implemented to manage the flow of people toward the hill, establishing control points and specific routes to avoid uncontrolled agglomerations. In addition, medical and emergency units were arranged to attend any eventuality during the development of the executions. The planning also considered the psychological impact on the population. By allowing massive attendance to the event, the authorities sought not only to punish the guilty, but also to offer the community a sensation of justice and closure after the horrors lived during the Nazi occupation. The visibility of the gallows from various points of the hill reinforced this objective, ensuring that the act was witnessed by the largest number of people possible. The condemned, among whom were figures like Jenny Wanda Barkman, Gerda Steinhoff, Elizabeth Becker, Wanda Klaff, and Eva Paradis, were transferred to the place in heavily guarded military vehicles. Each one of them had been declared guilty of crimes against humanity during the trials of Stutthof, carried out between April and May 1946. Their presence on the gallows represented the culmination of a judicial process that sought to hold accountable those who, sheltered in their role within the Nazi regime, perpetrated acts of extreme cruelty. The call attracted an estimated crowd of 200,000 people, reflecting the deep longing for justice of a society devastated by the war and the Nazi atrocities. Men, women, and children congregated on the hill, some seeking to close personal wounds, others moved by the desire to witness an act of long-awaited retribution. The atmosphere was loaded with emotions, from the expectant silence to murmurs of approval, and on occasions expressions of contained anger. The massive presence evidenced not only the desire for justice, but also the collective need to witness the punishment of those who had inflicted so much suffering. The method of execution chosen was hanging by the short drop system, a technique that causes death by slow strangulation instead of an immediate cervical rupture. This deliberately selected procedure prolonged the agony of the condemned, serving as a form of emphasizing the gravity of their crimes. The effects on the executed were visible and disturbing: convulsive movements, congested faces, and a desperate struggle for the air that did not arrive. Each execution was carried out sequentially, allowing the crowd to fully absorb the impact of each death. The choice of this method underlined the intention of the authorities to impose a punishment that reflected the severity of the crimes committed. The reactions of the public were varied. Some spectators showed satisfaction upon seeing the perpetrators face the consequences of their acts, considering it an act of poetic justice. Others, however, experienced discomfort or even repulsion upon witnessing the brutality of the process, questioning the morality of responding to violence with more violence. The testimonies of the time reflect a mixture of relief and reflection, with individuals recognizing the need for justice, but also facing the ethical complexities of public executions. This event in Biskupia Gorka not only represented the punishment to the guilty, but also served as a collective reminder of the human cost of barbarity and the importance of justice in the reconstruction of a wounded society. The mass execution in Biskupia Gorka, July 4, 1946, remains in historical memory as an act of retributive justice and a manifestation of the collective pain of a nation that sought to heal the wounds inflicted by the Nazi occupation. This event symbolizes the determination of a society to confront its past and ensure that such atrocities do not remain unpunished nor repeat in the future. The death marches of Stutthof, the exodus of the condemned. The arrival of the winter of 1945 brought with it the imminent collapse of the Third Reich. With the Red Army advancing from the east and the Allied forces pushing from the west, Nazi Germany found itself in a desperate retreat. In this context, the order to evacuate the Stutthof concentration camp not only responded to the need to avoid that the prisoners were liberated by the Soviets, but also to an attempt to erase the traces of the extermination. The directive came from the highest spheres of the Nazi regime. The prisoners should not fall alive into enemy hands. From the end of 1944, the commanders of Stutthof knew that their camp was condemned. The Soviet offensive in East Prussia had broken the German lines and the supply routes were crumbling. Aware that time was running out, Paul Werner Hoppe, the last commander of the camp, received instructions to evacuate the majority of the prisoners and destroy any trace of the extermination machinery. The orders were blunt. The sick and weak prisoners who could not march would be executed on the spot, and the rest would be sent in forced marches toward the west, regardless of the climatic conditions or the physical resistance of the deportees. On January 25, 1945, the SS began the evacuation. More than 50,000 prisoners were still in the camp, but only about 30,000 were considered fit for the march. Those who could not stay on their feet were abandoned to their fate or shot on the spot. There was no margin for pity nor space for compassion. The prisoners, weakened by months or years of starvation, diseases, and forced labor, were organized in columns that advanced at a forced pace through the icy roads of Pomerania and East Prussia. Some did not even have shoes, others carried rags that barely protected them from the cold. The temperature oscillated between -10 and -20 degrees C, and the snow covered the ground with an implacable layer. The Nazi officers knew that many of the deportees would die on the way. In fact, that was the purpose of the evacuation. It was not a transfer, but a deferred execution. The guards were ordered to shoot anyone who lagged behind or showed signs of exhaustion. It was prohibited for the inhabitants of the nearby villages to offer food or shelter to the prisoners. And any civilian caught helping the deportees could be punished with death. In many cases, the prisoners were forced to sleep outdoors in open fields or on the margins of the roads, where the cold killed the weakest before dawn. The columns of prisoners advanced slowly through the icy landscape, enveloped in a silence broken only by the wind and the crunching of the snow under their feet. The orders were clear. They had to march without rest, regardless of their physical state. Those who collapsed from exhaustion or cold were executed on the spot. There were no stops to eat, no prolonged rest was allowed, and any attempt to stray from the group was punished with immediate death. In addition to the cold, hunger added to the torture. After days without receiving food, some prisoners tried to eat snow to calm the desperation. But the sensation of cold in the stomach only worsened their weakness. The most desperate sought roots or pieces of wood to chew, anything that gave them the illusion of ingesting something. The executions were constant and public. If someone fell, they were executed without prior warning. The Nazi guards shot without hesitating, leaving the bodies in the snow as a warning for the others. The march did not stop even for the dying. The prisoners had to dodge the corpses of their fallen companions, many of them still agonizing, unable to move while the cold consumed them slowly. On some occasions, the guards themselves used the executions as entertainment. They amused themselves by shooting the stragglers in different parts of the body, prolonging their suffering before giving them the coup de grace. The testimonies of the few who managed to survive describe scenes of absolute horror. A prisoner related how on a particularly cold night, the guards ordered a group of deportees to huddle together to give each other warmth, only to then open fire on them, leaving their bodies piled in the snow. Another testimony tells that at certain moments the guards simply got tired of advancing and ordered the prisoners to dig their own pits in the snow before being shot en masse. These episodes of brutality were not exceptional. They were part of a systematic strategy of covert extermination. The prisoners who managed to survive the brutality of the forced marches did not find relief in their final destination. For many, the journey had only been a delay in the inevitable execution. A significant number of prisoners was directed toward the coast of the Baltic Sea, where the SS carried out systematic massacres. On the beaches and icy dunes, the groups of prisoners were forced to dig their own pits under the gaze of the guards. Despite their extreme weakness, those who did not dig fast enough were beaten or shot on the spot. Once the ditches were ready, the Nazis lined up the prisoners on the edge and shot them in the back, letting the bodies fall one over the other in a macabre pile of corpses. Those who did not die instantaneously were buried alive under the next batch of victims in an attempt to hide the massacre. For other prisoners, death came in an even more cruel and ruthless way. Aware that the Allied forces were getting closer, the Nazis devised a quick and efficient method to get rid of large quantities of prisoners. The murder in the sea, thousands of deportees were transported to the nearby ports and forced to board ships under the false promise of evacuation. Weak and without another option, the prisoners were overcrowded in the holds of freighters and barges without provisions nor ventilation. Once the ships ventured into the sea, the Nazi crew members abandoned them to their fate, or in some cases directly sank them, sabotaging the hulls of the vessels so that they filled with water quickly. In minutes, the ships began to submerge, trapping hundreds of prisoners inside. Some tried to escape, but the icy waters of the Baltic did not offer salvation. Even those who managed to get out of the holds died of hypothermia or drowned before being able to reach the shore. The testimonies of the survivors describe terrifying scenes. In some cases, the prisoners who were still on deck were forced to jump into the sea at bayonet point, while the Nazis observed impassively as the cold and the waves did their work. Other accounts indicate that on certain occasions the guards themselves shot at the deportees in the water, ensuring that no witness was left alive. These acts of mass murder in the sea reflect the final desperation of the Nazis to eliminate any proof of their crimes before the imminent arrival of the Allies. Of the thousands of prisoners who undertook the evacuation of Stutthof, less than 15% managed to survive until the liberation. Many of those who escaped with life did so thanks to the confusion of the collapse of the Third Reich, hiding in forests or being rescued by local populations that, at risk of their own safety, provided them shelter. Others were found by the Red Army, which advanced implacably over the remains of the Nazi domain. However, even for those who managed to survive, the liberation did not mean the end of their suffering. The extreme malnutrition, the diseases, and the psychological trauma would accompany them for the rest of their lives. For them, freedom had arrived too late. The proofs of the horror perpetrated during the evacuation of Stutthof began to emerge immediately after the arrival of the Red Army to the region. What the Soviet soldiers found was an image of absolute devastation. Roads covered with frozen corpses, remains of mass executions on the Baltic coast, and prisoners too weak to even speak about what happened. The military reports describe terrifying scenes with bodies piled in shallow ditches and traces of hasty shootings in the snow. Some still living prisoners were found in critical state, unable to move due to hunger and diseases, with their faces marked by desperation and extreme suffering. The testimonies of the liberators reflect the impact of these images with soldiers who, despite having seen the ravages of the war on the Eastern Front, were shocked by the brutality of the extermination in Stutthof. In parallel, the International Red Cross and other assistance organizations that arrived shortly after began to document the atrocities. Detailed lists of missing prisoners were elaborated, testimonies of the survivors were registered, and forensic reports on the cause of death of thousands of victims were compiled. These records were fundamental to clarify the crimes committed in the final phase of the camp and served as crucial proofs in the subsequent trials. They also helped to reconstruct the exact trajectory of the death marches and to calculate how many prisoners had been murdered on the journey or sent to their death in the sea. With the evidence in hand, the search for the responsible became a priority for the Polish and Soviet authorities. Unlike the crimes committed within the concentration camp, which in some cases could be diluted in the complex bureaucracy of the Nazi system, the evacuation of Stutthof presented a more direct case of premeditated mass murder. The extermination orders were clear, and the officers who supervised the marches and executions could not justify their actions under the argument of following general orders from Berlin. As a result, several of the high commands responsible for the evacuation were identified, captured, and subjected to trial in Gdansk in the years after the conflict. Among the accused were SS officers who directed the marches, supervisors of the transport of prisoners, and members of the camp administration who had participated in the planning of the evacuation. During the trials, the testimonies of the survivors were devastating. They related the brutality of the guards on the journey, the arbitrary executions in the snow, and the cruel methods used to get rid of the deportees in the sea. The proofs compiled by the Soviet soldiers and the documents of the Red Cross were presented before the tribunal, detailing with precision the scope of the slaughter. The verdict of the trials was forceful. It was determined that the evacuation of Stutthof had not been a simple relocation of prisoners before the advance of the Red Army, but a deliberate act of final extermination. This conclusion reinforced the historical recognition of the death marches as a crucial phase within the Holocaust, evidencing that until the last moment the Nazi regime prioritized the annihilation of its victims before allowing them to survive the war. For the captured responsible, justice was quick and severe. Many were condemned to death or to long prison sentences. However, for the tens of thousands of victims who perished in the marches and in the sea, the trial arrived too late. Stutthof in memory, justice, oblivion, and the traces of horror, the legacy of the executions of Stutthof and its impact on collective memory have been object of reflection and debate throughout the decades. Today, the history of Stutthof and its executioners is remembered through various means that seek to preserve the memory and educate future generations about the atrocities committed. The Stutthof concentration camp has been transformed into a museum and place of memory where documents, photographs, and personal objects of the victims and perpetrators are exhibited. This space serves as a tangible reminder of the horrors of the Holocaust and offers visitors a deep understanding of the inhuman conditions that prevailed there. Through exhibitions and educational programs, the museum seeks to keep alive the memory of the victims and foster reflection on the lessons of history. The role of the guardians in the concentration camps, especially in Stutthof, has been object of analysis and debate. These women, who actively participated in the supervision and in many cases in the perpetration of abuses and murders, challenge the traditional perceptions of gender and violence. Historical studies have documented cases of extreme brutality by these guardians. What has led to discussions about their individual responsibility and the dynamics of power in the Nazi regime. The figure of Jenny Wanda Barkmann, known as the Beautiful Spectre for her cruelty in Stutthof, exemplifies the complexity of this phenomenon. Her active participation in the selection of prisoners for the gas chambers and her behavior during the trials highlight the brutality that some of these women exercised. Biskupia Gorka, in place of the public executions of the war criminals of Stutthof, has acquired a significant symbolism as a site of historical justice. The choice of this place for the executions was not casual. Its visibility and accessibility allowed a crowd to witness the act, serving as a public manifestation of justice and a warning against future crimes. Today, Biskupia Gorka is recognized as a place of memory that symbolizes retribution and closure for a community deeply affected by the atrocities of the war. This site reminds of the importance of facing the past and ensures that the learned lessons are not forgotten. The memory of Stutthof and the executions in Biskupia Gorka continue to be relevant in education about the Holocaust and in the promotion of human rights. Through the preservation of these places and the diffusion of their stories, it is sought to honor the victims and guarantee that future generations understand the importance of resisting injustice and oppression in all its forms.